Hi guys, so today I wanted to cover analysis material for chapters 3 and 4 of the Dressmaker, and we're going to be centering our analysis on comparison with the Crucible. So, jumping into chapter 3, we immediately see that the townspeople's acceptance of Teddy McSweeney is conditional. It's based on his merit as a person and his ability when he plays football and his initiative. Now, in this regard, Teddy and Tilly are actually quite similar in that Tilly finds some degree of acceptance. It's not a huge level of acceptance, but she finds some degree of acceptance because of her skills as a seamstress. Though I suppose she herself would not agree with being called a seamstress. We're also introduced to Mae McSweeney, and the book describes her as having a plastic flower behind her ear, round and neat, with a scrubbed, freckled complexion. So we're introduced to her in a way where she seems quite upright, quite unpretentious, and yet there's something slightly tacky about her with the plastic flower, but that's to be expected because she's from Dunkirk. Now, Mad Molly says you can't keep anything secret here, and you can basically mark out that entire section up to its open slather on outcasts. And it's a good quote to explain the relationship between the people of Dungata. It's also a good point of comparison with the Crucible, because unlike the people of Dungata, who have this social contract in which they will not expose each other's secrets and their personal misdeeds, in the Crucible, the residents of Salem must falsely condemn each other in order to survive. And that's a great segue for us to start talking about the social contract theory. So, in ethics, social contracts are these rules that we set in terms of how we treat others and how others treat us. They're often unspoken. Now, in the Dressmaker, there's this small insular society, and the people's interactions in that society are guided by a dysfunctional social contract because it allows their their dirty secrets to get away, and people don't really atone for them. There's no sense of accountability. And that kind of environment fosters exaggerated versions of everyday flaws like nosiness and hypocrisy. Now, in the Crucible, the social contracts kind of fall apart because it's about the chaos that ensues when a social contract is no longer honoured. And we see that in that even people who kind of symbolized the pinnacle of moral and ethical behavior in their society were put to death for that. And we see that in Rebecca Nurse. Now, Arthur Miller calls it the growing pains of their society's evolution, and he says that, it's the end of American theocracy. Now, I don't 100% agree with it being the end of American theocracy, but politics isn't really what we're studying here. It's just a good comparison to make. Now, that's about all for chapter 3. There's a little bit more which we'll get into a tiny bit later, but chapter 3 is very, very short, and that's really the main body of everything that you need to know for chapter 3, which is why we're merging chapter 3 and 4 together. So in chapter 4, we start off seeing Tilly and Molly together, and we see an Onkaparinga rug draped over Molly's wheelchair, and that shows us the filial love that Tilly has for Molly because it's a form of cashmere, and we can compare it back to the very coarse material that Molly was sitting in at the beginning of the novel. And that filial love is never explicitly stated, but we see it when Tilly is digging through the rubbish tip as well to find a wheelchair in chapter 3. Ignore the typo there where I said Finn's a wheelchair. So Tilly's filial love for her mother is once again never explicitly stated, and we'll cover this a little bit later on in this this video, and it's connected closely with the next quote. And it says, "Does Marigold know? No, Marigold doesn't know anything." And that's an exchange between Lois Pickett and Beulah Harradine. So it foreshadows that the Pettymans are involved in Tilly's past. Now, that's probably a really good kind of launching point to start talking about Brecht and Hemingway in the two texts. So we've talked about Brecht before with reference to Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and it's where historical context and any other information is explicitly stated. It's often done by a narrator or an aside where a character kind of goes off on a tangent and starts talking about the historical context. Now, Arthur Miller tells us directly through the narrator that the events of the witch trials are a part of a shift to a new society that no longer lives by the rules of the old one, and he also gives us this detailed introduction to the main characters as well. So Brecht was all about putting everything on the table from the start so that we can engage intellectually. Now, Hemingway believed that the true essence and the deeper meaning behind a text or any kind of writing should be hidden beneath the surface of the words, where the words don't explicitly say what's meant, but they give us an idea of what's being implied. This is also called the iceberg theory or the theory of omission. So why is it called the theory of omission? Because omission means to leave something out, and we see a great example of that in chapter 3, and we also see it a lot in chapter 4. For example, in chapter 3, we see that the gossips are saying she left town as a youngster when, and then it's cut off. Now, these stories are told in these specific ways for a reason. It's not a coincidence, and they do make for great comparison. So the Dressmaker is about the gradual exploration of the moral deterioration of a society that on the surface seems to be quite unpretentious, quiet, and peaceful. And it culminates in the exposition. Oh, I shouldn't say that. That's a little bit of an archaic use of the word exposition. The kind of revelation of this deterioration, this rot in their society. And then there's a symbolic purging of it through Tilly burning the entire town down. So there's no historical context necessary to understand it. The kind of human suffering there is universal. People understand it. Now, The Crucible has this rich historical context which really lends itself to Brechtian storytelling. You'll also see this with, actually it's no longer on the text list, but you will also see it if you have looked into The Longest Memory and The Longest Memory and Black Diggers. Anything that has historical context really lends itself to Brechtian storytelling. And the audience is likely to already know about Salem and the witch trials, so Arthur Miller uses the Brechtian storytelling, the narrator explaining everything, to give his take on the events. And the important thing to note here is that it depicts a single event which changed American society. It doesn't so much focus itself on what happened in the lead up to it. So in that sense, the Brechtian storytelling allows us to get a little bit of that context so that it doesn't feel like it's coming out of nowhere. Okay, so that exploration of Brechtian and the theory of omission really acts as a good segue into the next part that I want to talk about. So we see two examples of the theory of omission when we see the 2 no 3 shillings part where Tilly is shopping and Beulah and Lois charge her extra. So Beulah says, oh, that'll be 2, and then she gets cut off, and Lois says 3 shillings. So it's clear that they're charging her more than they ought to because of this sense of disdain or distaste for her. They don't like her, they despise her. Once again, we also see it when Molly says, something's burning my back. So it's talking about the gaze of the people. They're looking at them, they're staring. So once again, it omits the core of what's happening beneath the surface of the words, but it gives us enough of an idea to put the pieces together. Now, Lois Pickett is introduced to us here in this chapter, and she has a bad habit of skin picking, hence the name Picket, and she's ironically a cleaner despite being unhygienic in that sense. Now, this is perhaps a bit of a tangential point, but skin picking has been theorized to be a result of overbearing parenting and a kind of fear and anxiety about the society that we live in. It stems from a place of anxiety. So it's a tangential point, but it does show us that Lois is perhaps in some way, in a very subtle way, a victim herself. Now, note that despite Molly's apparent loss of her sanity, her observations about people are spot on. And we'll talk about this madness in a little bit, because it gives Molly an outsider perspective. Why? Well, it ties into how madness is treated in these two societies. So, Molly was driven mad with grief. Largely men were at fault for this, because of what happened with Evan Pettyman, as well as Stuart Pettyman, and how they sent Tilly away. But in a literary sense, it acts as a device through which she can break the social contract of the people living in that town, because she kind of gets away with saying nasty but truthful things about people to their faces. And that's part of the reason why perhaps people don't like her, and it goes beyond just her sleeping with Evan Pettyman and giving birth to his child, because there are plenty of people who have affairs in Dungata. It's because she's breaking the social contract and she can get away with it. She can tell other people's business on the street in front of many people, and there wouldn't be any real repercussions for her, because if people tell her past and her story, it doesn't affect her anymore because she's mad. Now, so in one sense, that acts as a device through which we can explore the characters in a more unbiased and unpretentious way. Now, in the Crucible, the girls were driven to hysteria by fear of accusation, as well as their own guilt at accusing and condemning the very people in their own community. So, when you see the references to being cold and you see Mary Warren rejoining Abigail's side at the trials, it's about that kind of escalating pressure, that kind of escalating heat that's put on them to keep up the act in order to tell a coherent story about what happened. And Betty being unconscious is perhaps a manifestation of her own anxiety and her fear. It's a psychological illness in response to the repression and the kind of fear of punishment that she experiences. And we see this escalating pressure and this escalating heat, both of which are great for analysis of the name of the text itself, the Crucible. At the end of Act 1, we see Betty and Abigail say, "I saw so-and-so with the devil," and it kind of builds. It's almost a chant. And then we see the curtain drop right after they repeat that over and over and over again. And it kind of creates this sense of tension that isn't resolved because the curtain drops immediately. Now, in the Crucible, the madness of the girls kind of creates a convincing story for the people who are trying to hunt witches. However, for us, we see it very differently. For us, the story is never really truly about whether or not the girls truly practiced witchcraft, because it is true that they were dancing in the woods, and it might even be true that they drank blood. But whether it was a real ritual or whether Tituba was just humouring Abigail so that Abigail wouldn't bother her about it anymore, that's kind of up for debate, but it's never explicitly addressed in the text. And the reason why the play never addresses it is because it's not what's really being explored here. To us, it's not a question of whether true witchcraft took place at Salem, and most people in our modern era would say that it didn't. But for us, that's not what we're exploring. We're exploring how humans react to that kind of pressure and heat, the paranoia, and that insular society where everyone's secrets are being, well, so-called secrets are being exposed. And when you look at what's happening there, women, the madness is gendered specifically with regard to women. And some of the imagery used of them flailing and convulsing and being strangled and acting, it evokes this kind of Dionysian almost imagery. For context, Dionysus was, or Dionysus, depending on who you're talking to, was the Greek god of wine, but also of what we call ecstasis. It's the Greek word from which we get the word ecstasy. So ecstasis means to be outside of your normal state. It's an escape from your normal social station, and and they had these big festivals where it was celebrated, where you could cast off your normal station, cast off your mundane life, and revel and enjoy yourself. So there's this kind of sense of that here, where they're casting off their chains of oppression as women, who were not allowed to own property, were not allowed to vote on matters, and it's kind of, it shows that they've left that behind, and there's this kind of madness or ecstasis that they're experiencing. Now back to chapter 4 of The Dressmaker. We see that Tilly buys a dress made out of green, I believe it's pronounced gorget, who knows? It's a fabric. You don't need to know how to say it, you only need to know how to spell it. So there are a couple of things to note about it. It's a sheer crepe made from silk. So silk here represents a kind of elegance that you don't see in the other townspeople in Dungatar. And it's made scandalous because of the dress that Tilly makes of it. The low neckline of it made people uncomfortable. They found it scandalous. And there are a couple of things to be said about that, which we'll get into. One part of it is transformative power and the power to adapt. So Tilly, when Tilly buys it, Gertrude says to her, if you're determined enough, you'll make something of it, because she finds the colour to be unusual, and she doesn't see how it can possibly be made to look winsome and beautiful. And on one hand, that represents her own small-mindedness, but on the other hand, it also shows that Tilly is able to transform the clothing in the same way that she transforms herself. She goes from being very timid and seeking the approval of the people of Dungatar to seeking vengeance on them for the way that they've treated her and her mother. The other thing that we could talk about is the imagery of the Harvest Maiden. So we see a lot of very distinctly pagan imagery in this novel, and the kind of undertones of there being a scandalous sensual aspect to the dress that she makes, in conjunction with the fact that it's green, kind of evokes the image of the Harvest Maiden, which was a pagan concept of a girl who was chosen and she would sow seeds in a field, and they believed that that would bring a bountiful harvest. And the girl who was chosen was always a maiden, and in some traditions she was bedded by a man, so it was kind of like ritualized sex almost. And that comes up because we see that tripartite goddess being presented in this novel. So here she's presenting as the maiden. In chapter 4, we also see Mr. Almanac and Mrs. Almanac's interactions, or almost, they're not quite interacting, the nature of their relationship, the dynamic between them. And Mr. Almanac says, all that is needed is God's forgiveness, a clean mind and a wholesome diet, plenty of red meat and well-cooked vegetables. So that's his justification for not treating his wife's arthritis, and he himself is kind of a pharmacist to the people of Dungatar in a way. So obviously we know that that's a justification, it's not a real reason. And there's very, very strongly implied abuse where Irma cast a warning look over to the chemist shop when Molly was thanking her for bringing, when Tilly was thanking her for bringing Molly food. And that entire quote, you can kind of mark that out, where it says, it starts with, she used to have a lot of falls, and then at the end of it, it says her injuries ceased. Now, there is a slight implication of Irma herself doing something to get revenge on her husband, Mr. Almanac. And it's that part where she says, Percival says, God is responsible for everything. So Percival Almanac says that God is responsible for everything, and then we see that she is asleep when he needs her to stop him from rolling down to his death. And it is possible that she's pretending. She's like, oh, everything, God is responsible for everything. Or it could just be irony, where he says God is responsible for everything, and indeed he gets this poetic justice that he deserved, as if God was there to punish him. And we also see it because Molly is very sharp and very astute in her observations about other people and her comments about other people. And she says the words, your husband's mighty slow these days, how did you manage that? So there's this implication of Irma Almanac getting revenge on her husband. It's never confirmed, it's never more explicitly stated than that, but it is a possibility. If it supports your analysis, you can talk about it. If it doesn't support your analysis, you can leave it, because it's quite subtle. You can choose to ignore it, or you can choose to talk about it. Now, at the end of chapter 4, we see that the people of the town bobbed together like chooks pecking at vegetable scraps as they looked at the hill. Now, this zoomorphic description is almost a little bit cruel, but I suppose the people of Dungatar aren't particularly compassionate to Tilly and Molly either. But it's that zoomorphic description that gives this sense of smallness and stupidity, almost. Now, the fact that Molly is so sharp might lead some people to question whether or not she's truly mad. And you see it especially in her interaction with Irma in this chapter, as well as a little bit later on in the text, you see it again. She has moments of lucidity and clarity where she almost seems like she isn't mad. But in response to that, I would say that she is definitely actually mad, because in her madness, she hurts herself and she hurts Tilly. She refuses to bathe. She is very dirty. Now, she also seems to have delusions that Tilly is trying to poison her. But in that case, why is it that she sometimes has moments of clarity and she sometimes has moments where she's delusional? And the reason for her moments of clarity is because it allows her to play a brutally honest character who openly speaks on the flaws of others without just gossiping and spreading lies about them, right? It's almost as if she becomes exempt from the social contract in that moment of clarity and can say whatever she wants about them. Now, you see that once everyone's flaws are established, she's pretty much played her role. We no longer need her to guide us and introduce us to each of the characters and what's wrong with them. And we see that once her role has been played, she gets a moment of clarity, which gives us the closure we need to say goodbye to her, and it gives her the closure and Tilly the closure that they need, and then she promptly dies. So it's almost as if once her literary kind of role in the text is complete, she's no longer needed, and then she goes on to play a very different role, where she becomes the catalyst, her death becomes the catalyst for Tilly to kind of wreak vengeance on the town. So thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned something, and I will see you in the next video.